Well, welcome to the Dean's Section program. Before we begin the official part of the program, I have one very important announcement. There is a lost scarf that was dropped in the hallway. Is it yours? Okay, good, it's lovely. I thought I might get to keep it. I want to wish you all a very, very happy New Year, and thank you for being here on such a rainy morning and during such a busy time. This program is the section for the Law School Dean. I am Joyce McConnell, the co-chair of the section for this year. I'd like to introduce Camille Nelson, who is the dean at Suffolk Law School and who is our co-chair as well. And Camille has been instrumental in putting together this panel, and that's not a way for me to blame her, but rather a way for us to share the work. And it has been truly a wonderful year, I think, for the section, although one full of some changes. But Camille and I actually started the idea for this panel at the ABA Dean's meeting in February of last year. And we started talking about how difficult times are for law schools, because of course if you're a law school dean, that's what you're going to want to talk about most of the time other than your kids. And we also began to talk about how difficult a time it is for higher education generally. That not only have law schools been suffering in this climate, but universities and colleges have also been suffering. So that means that here we are embedded, we're struggling as deans of law schools, and then our universities are struggling as well. So we decided to focus this panel on higher ed and legal ed partnering for success in challenging times. In February of 2015, I was the dean. In July of 2015, I actually, without any intent to do so, became the provost of our university. And so it gave me a very interesting position to be in, because I thought I was going to be moderating this panel as a dean, but I'm actually playing a dual role here because I'm going to moderate and also comment. But as you can see from our panelists, and we have a wonderful panel here, we have a panel of former law school deans who are now higher ed administrators at various levels. And we thought that in some ways this might be the very best way to begin a conversation about how to navigate these worlds for the success of law schools and higher ed. And to my left first is Phoebe Haddon, who was the dean at the University of Maryland School of Law and is now chancellor and professor at Rutgers School of Law in Camden, New Jersey. No? Not the law school. Professor at the law school, chancellor of the university at Camden. That's a better way to put it, yes. I'm beginning to understand their structure. Kent Severud was dean at several places, right? A serial dean, we like to say. Most recently at Washington University in St. Louis, where he then became the chancellor, or president, I think you were called there, and now is the chancellor president of Syracuse. So a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to hear from Kent and his experience. And then John Valerie White, who's provost at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, William S. Boyd School of Law, and came from the law school before he ascended to provost. And so what we want to bring to you today is the start of a conversation about how the world is viewed in higher ed by higher ed administrators, how law schools are often viewed by higher ed administrators, and how deans of law schools, based on this conversation, might be able to understand the different weights that are given to different needs at the university, and how the law school might actually rise to the top in certain ways, and how to make your law school shine for your provost and your president. In addition, we want to talk about what law school deans and law school faculties can do for higher ed generally, and how that can help us all mutually. So I actually am not going to do formal introductions of each of our panelists because I actually want to start with each of them telling their own journey to the position they find themselves in now. And I'm going to start with Phoebe.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back home again, so to speak. My journey can be characterized as a 6-month or a 30-year journey because I never wanted to be a dean. I always wanted to be a president or someone involved in higher education at a higher level from the time that I was a member of the faculty of law. And it started from that standpoint from my experiences as a member of the board of Smith College for 10 years and as a student at the Bryn Mawr Hers Institute for higher education. Those two experiences 20 years ago were life-changing for me from the standpoint of seeing myself as someone more deeply involved in addressing the issues of higher education. And they also were enhanced by a number of the board positions that I also became involved in through AALS and through the Law School Admissions Council and other law-related boards and nonprofit organizations that address issues related to access and diversity. So my journey has been a long one, but my experience, more relevant to today's discussion, is a short one. I've been a chancellor for 6 months, and the reason why I politely, I hope, corrected the characterization of what chancellor means is because the structure of higher education, many of you know, is changing, but is complex. Ken is a chancellor of the highest part of the system. I am chancellor of a campus, and there is a president that is over our system. The University of Maryland similarly had a chancellor at the head and presidents at individual campuses. So it's a mixed bag in terms of what you can expect when you, when you come to have a title, but also when you come to the job. The last 6 months are part of about a year and a half of real transition for Rutgers University, in part because Rutgers University New Brunswick, one of 3 campuses, or universities now we call them, has now moved to the Big Ten, and that means that that campus, though not ours, is part of the Big Ten faculty and the Big Ten visibility. It means that as long as we have a leader who is the president of the university, Rutgers One University is what it used to be called, we will have the benefit of the prestige and power that goes along with that name. But it's a difficult question as we move forward as to whether or not that will remain. For us, the important thing is that our faculty are all one and our students get one diploma. So we're a very close-knit system, not a dispersed system like many others, including Maryland. So I came into this situation knowing some of that from Maryland as dean in a system, but also being a dean for only 5 years and not having the complexity and the understanding of the complexity of many other places. The last 100 days have been a very interesting one for me. We were involved in strategic planning right away as soon as I got there. This had been a couple of year process for all of the universities as they thought about what a system looked like. But it appeared important to me to take some time and get to know the faculty as well as the students by talking about strategic planning. So I'd like to talk about that later, what I learned during that 100 days. We're now into the second 100 days, and we're talking about implementation. So I'm now grappling with the issue of, now we have wonderful ideas and initiatives. What can we do with them, and how does the law school fit in that?
That's great.
So it's been an interesting 6 months.
Okay. All right, so I'm John White. I'm provost at UNLV. I was dean at the Boyd School of Law there for 5 years. I went into legal education mostly because I thought it was a way for me to make a difference, whatever that means. As a law faculty member, that proved to be more frustrating than I'd hoped it would be. And so going into the deanship was a way, not necessarily make a difference in the areas or ways that I had initially set out to, but to be more involved in something I cared about, legal education. So my move to the provost office was in that same vein. Like many of you, we had undergone severe cuts during the downturn period of the recession, and those cuts at the university level were even more deep because of their inability to make any of it up really by tuition increases. So at the time, we had had a president for 4 years or 3 years, and we're looking for a provost, and really it was a school that had this tremendous potential because it had grown dramatically over the prior 10 years, essentially doubling in size. It served a community that also more than doubled over the same 10-year period. It was a unique university in a particular way, which was that it served this community that modeled where demographers think the country will be in 2030, such as the current demographics of Las Vegas. It was the only university there. It had moved from being a regional campus to a Carnegie 2 and aspired to be Carnegie 1, or aspires to be Carnegie 1. So there's a lot of sort of connectivity there, but it was also this tremendously diverse campus, and one that was becoming more diverse every day. So when I became provost, I think our minority population was 38%. It's now 55%. We think it'll be 65 in the next few years. And a very diverse minority population, probably, I think we're now at about 25% Latinos and about 18% Asian and a little over 10% African American, but also a school that really was dealing with a huge proportion of first-generation college students. So that mix of students, the opportunity of the school at the time was all extremely attractive to me. And when sort of recruited to be the provost by the president, I thought it was a unique opportunity to sort of deal with the crisis, which I was already doing as a law school dean, but to do it in a broader way and perhaps with more stability than we had seen at the university side, since universities are less stable in this way than sort of smaller units like law schools. But I think also really connecting to this broader notion of service that had guided me. And so that was probably a crazy reason to become provost, but it was one at least that made me feel good about doing the job, which is pretty demanding and not particularly glorious, particularly as compared to the dean of the only law school in a state where everybody sort of taps you on the back and say, Dean, why don't you tell me about these commercial law issues that you know nothing about? But I think the transition was a fulfilling one for the reasons I suggested and continues to be, but it's also foreshadowing just a bit where I think we're going to be going in this conversation. Many universities have, while unique, very tremendous issues that overshadow the significant crises that those same universities have at their law schools, and I think that's the tension that I've had. What's been helpful for me was that the law school's always been a separate budget item in the state budget, and so this Chinese wall, so to speak, between their budget and the university budget made it easier for me as a law dean to be the provost, because immediately, I think in the typical transition, everybody suspects you're going to be serving your prior school, and that budget distinction insulated me from some of that. But as soon as the enrollment crisis hit, I still get those questions, and people are sort of sitting around saying, are you going to take all of our money and give it to the law school? Even though it wouldn't really actually take all that much money to fix the law school issue, you'd still confront that sort of question. So that's how I got there.
So I'm Kat Siverud. I have this sense of deja vu in which I became a dean in the 1990s. And based on my vast 11 months of experience as a dean, I was summoned to a conference of presidents and provosts on the university and its law school, and expected to share great wisdom with presidents and provosts about law schools. So now I am here based on 1 year experience as a chancellor and sharing wisdom with you about universities. I was a dean for, an associate dean for 18 years before a year ago becoming chancellor and president at Syracuse. I loved law schools, loved being a dean, and envy those of you, even in the current environment, who are deans. What I loved about it is the collectivity that is the faculties, that it's the whole faculty together, deliberates many things, which is uncommon in many other disciplines. And I loved the common training that almost all the faculty had, which made it vocabulary and debate interesting. I became a chancellor and president because I'd been dean for 18 years, and it was starting to get like I'd seen everything twice or three times, and including budget crises, including enrollment crises, including all the unique problems that face legal education. And I was getting interested more and more in the broader level questions because of service assignments to chair searches for other parts of the university or to open programs elsewhere in the university. And so believed in keep learning always. And so this is a way to learn new things. Now, having been chancellor for a year, I didn't realize much of the learning would be about athletics. As Rutgers joined the Big Ten, Syracuse joined the ACC, and for all the challenges and opportunities law schools are facing in this key time of transition, I would say college athletics is going through even more. So that's my journey. I went to Syracuse because it's a great university, and I grew up in upstate New York, and that's where my family and roots are, and it's a great place to be back at.
Well, that's great. Thank you. I'm going to actually take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about my journey. I'm serving two roles as moderator and also sharing this transition from dean to provost. But I'm one of those reluctant faculty members who unfortunately happen to be good at administration. And there are probably many of you sitting in this room who found yourself first as associate deans because of that, and then deans after that. I just always wanted to be a law professor. I had no other goal. My goal was very limited. I really wanted that life, and I wanted to teach in public law schools. And I became an associate dean and then a dean, and between the two of them, I actually served 11 years, 6 as dean and 5 as an associate dean. And then within 24 hours, literally, I became a provost. Again, not something that I was seeking, but I gave it tremendous amount of thought within those 24 hours. While driving to the Belmont races for my daughter's birthday. And I told her what I was contemplating, and she said, and this reflects what our other panelists have said, provost, that doesn't sound nearly as important as a dean. Which is true, right? It doesn't sound nearly as important as a dean. And as John said, I'm at West Virginia University. We also are the only law school in the state. And that is an extraordinary privileged position to be in, and provost feels very different than that. On the other hand, provost has been one of the most exciting things I've ever done, and I've only done it for 6 months. But here are some of the reasons. They've all been mentioned by our panelists, so I'm going to tie it together for a minute. First, starting with something Kent said, which is the opportunity to see the whole picture and figure out how to contribute. in the midst of that whole picture. For me, access to higher education has been a driver in my life. And so that drove what I did as a law school dean, but then to have the opportunity to think about freshmen and what it means for freshmen to actually have access to higher ed has just been huge, and I never anticipated it would. Budget times are lean, as we all know. It was really exciting for me to scale up from a law school size budget to a university size budget. And we have 33,000 students. We have a $2 billion budget if you include our health sciences. And in our model at the university, the provost really is a very, very strong position within the university and very empowered by the dean, by the president. The other thing that came to me as a big shock is that we joined the Big 12. I didn't know what the Big 12 was. I love football, I love basketball, I love baseball, I love all sports, but I really never focused in on what it meant in higher education. And so I suddenly find myself now in this very big, important conference where athletics matters significantly, and that has been really interesting for me. And finally, it just has given me an opportunity to work with my dean colleagues, which is an interesting experience to go from being dean and then working with your dean colleagues, and understanding much more about their disciplines and their struggles and the contributions they make to the university and how they perceive a small professional unit like a law school, which has been really fascinating and enlightening for me in terms of allocation of resources. So the next issue we're going to look at actually is one that we've all mentioned already, which is budget and enrollment. And obviously, law schools are having enrollment issues, but institutions of higher ed are having enrollment issues as well. And generally, the way a university approaches that is to tell everyone to increase enrollment in whatever discipline. And often law schools are not in a position to do that because they're one of the only units within any university that has no undergraduates, right? So it makes that funnel pretty narrow. And that, of course, affects budget position within the university. So each of our panelists is going to address that next. You want to start?
So how would you like us to talk about this?
That's okay.
Yeah.
Talk about how the enrollment pressures at the university at the top then trickle down to the various units, how difficult it is for a law school to respond given its position.
I can say that the law school has typically been the driver, as many of you know, and the opportunity from the university side is to think about the situation where the law school can really help to contribute to the resources, and that's changed dramatically. I think that coming from a law school that had already gone through a downsizing, I was very appreciative of the fact that that downsizing, at least from my vantage point, is not going to change. That this is a reality that we have to work with. And so it became very important to talk about ways that there could be alternative revenue streams, and very important to talk about ways that we collaborate for efficiencies within the budget. Very quickly, this summer, I come from a very small university now. Rutgers-Camden is not Rutgers-New Brunswick. Rutgers-New Brunswick is 65,000. Rutgers-Camden is 6,500. And so it's a critically different way of thinking about things. Being in a system where the 65,000 is the scale makes it even more challenging because we always have to say, but that's not the case at Rutgers-Camden. And that has become the mantra. We have to speak in terms of proportionality, but we also have to speak in terms of equity. And so I find those same sort of things being discussed when I meet with the deans to talk about how we will look at enrollment going forward, because Rutgers-Camden is also a university that draws upon a transfer population. And as Joyce and I were talking, that means that you don't know what the enrollment is going to look like until the very last minute. Rutgers University as a whole has moved to RCM, responsibility centered management. Most of you now know about that. But when I was dean, that had not occurred. And so this was a real stiff learning curve over the last several years. And it's hit me in the face as chancellor, because we now have to be responsible, which means that the money is not going to come from elsewhere. It's going to come from our campus. And what we have to plan to do has to be connected to our campus. Rutgers University as a whole has 2 law schools, and in a minute I'll talk about the changes that might come out of that, but the 2 law schools mean that we have to really be concerned about the implications of downsizing for the entire system, not just for our campus. So it's those kinds of things that I think we have to really be focused on. It means that the planning has to be long-term, 5 years, not 1 year or 2 years. That's something that I was used to in the past. It means that because of the size of the system itself, we really have to think in terms of how we can share in the future, not under the budgeting system, but in terms of cooperative efforts with faculty and with schools, and whether we can take down some of the divisions between the separate campuses as we think about the most efficient use of our resources. Luckily, I have a good working relationship with the other chancellors, each of whom has had different experiences than me, and we've been able to talk about how we can do those kinds of things in a sharing way. And the most important news that came out of this is, as I mentioned before, the 2 law schools are now really moving forward towards merger. And that will have a dramatic impact in terms of what we can do, both in terms of marketing visibility, but also in terms of budget, quite frankly.
So I think in terms of thinking about enrollment from the university perspective, it's really the thing that obsesses, that I'm obsessed about all the time, and which controls my staff, and really our regents are focused on to a tremendous degree. As an urban public university, traditionally our role was a sorting operation. Students came, our faculty didn't really care too much about which ones succeeded or not. Their job was to decide who worked hard enough, who was smart enough, and to identify those people and graduate them. And we're in the midst of a tremendous sea change in higher education, where simply put, that's not acceptable. It's bizarre because as a faculty member for many years, even as a law faculty member, I still view that as an appropriate role. You know, that there are many students who are not prepared for, interested in, or prepared to work hard enough to get a college degree. But all of our funders have asked a simple question: why am I spending money on this if you can't deliver students who graduate? So the first and very substantial change is that for a public school that was essentially open admissions for most of its life, we have a faculty who see their job as sorting people, and all of a sudden that's not their job. It's not acceptable, they can't do it, and my job as provost and their dean's job is to tell them that that's not acceptable, and as you might guess, that's not an easy sell. In the meantime, there's a tremendous amount of enrollment management sort of steps that we're undertaking, some of which don't belong to me because our admissions office is a separate office, and that's a bad thing. So our admissions folk are admitting people who are not prepared to succeed. They come to our colleges choosing majors that they're not remotely prepared to succeed in, and those deans are then held to, well, why do you have a 15% graduation rate? And they're like, well, those kids don't know any math, and we're engineers, and on and so forth. But the challenge for me is, how do I evaluate one dean who has a 15% graduation rate that's probably appropriate, and here's another dean who has a 40% graduation rate that's probably absolutely inappropriate. So the challenge in trying to come up with a system that can evaluate the deans in question, can create the incentives for us to be able to deal with student success across the board is substantial. And related to that is a shift that we're undergoing where until very recently our budget was based on essentially on student headcount. And so there's a chase for student headcount from college to college, department to department. And our department chairs believe that if they have a 10% spike in student headcount, they should get a line for that. And the answer is no, you can't, because we're not under that system anymore. And instead, the system that our state has adopted is one that focuses specifically on student success, specifically on student course completion, though fortunately they've determined that an F is completion, so we won't have a huge, well, I mean, it's not insignificant, right? You'd have this huge incentive for grade inflation to get completers, and we'd have all these people with Ds who really had Fs. But in any case, you know, from the provost office perspective, these issues are paramount. It's all we spend our time focusing on, and as you know, they have basically nothing to do with law school or any of the other professional schools that we have. What that means is that almost all the resources in the provost's office are focused on issues that really are not relevant to the challenges that law schools are facing. But since law school enrollments have been dropping, the perception of all the other deans and of their faculty and of the chairs is their enrollment's dropping, why aren't they being cut? Why aren't you taking from them those lines and giving it to us? Look, we just had a 10% increase in enrollment, where are my lines? And I mean, literally, I like walk around and people like roll up to me and they say, you just are screwing over us because we had a 10% increase and you didn't give us our lines. I was like, no, you don't have any lines. They're my lines. But I don't actually say that because that's not effective. But nonetheless, you can see that the law school enrollment challenges, significant though they are, in this kind of context are really not animating the rest of the campus. And in fact, to the extent the rest of the campus focuses on it, they focus on it from the perspective that they're being wrong because we're treating the law school special or different. And notwithstanding the budget wall that I described before, being a law school dean become provost, I think exacerbates that a little bit.
On enrollment, I just say, first of all, remind everybody we're being videotaped, and so the deans who want to say particularly provocative things, there's some private session later in the day, apparently, for you to do that. We'll be more temperate. I went back for this question and read what I said to presidents and provosts on the same question 20 years ago, and it was very humbling because my speech now, from a perspective of doing this for a year, my speech kind of reads like the book The Brethren, which some of you may remember was an account of the Supreme Court by Bob Woodward that made it sound like the law clerks did everything. It was a very law school kind of centric perspective on the whole university, and it reflected a great deal of angst and insecurity of the law school within the university, my own speech. And it felt, I mean, just to quote a line from it, could the university please stop regarding the law school the way Iraq regards Kuwait as the lost 19th province with all the oil that can produce revenue for it? And of course, the irony of that, of course, is that things come around, right? The economy balances, and now I hear many law school deans feeling like they're regarded by the university in enrollment terms like the European Union regards Albania. You know, like, do we really want this poor country to be part of us because it will be a drain on us in various ways? And of course, the truth is that the university, what I've learned from the year in the job is that even with all this law background and all this law history, now that I'm in the job, the law school is not the center of the universe in the university. It's not the center budgetarily. All your challenges budgetarily with your budgets and your deficits or your enrollment are not a major factor in the overall university challenge. Candidly, it's a small fraction, not a major fraction in terms of personnel, and not a major fraction in terms of where the university leaders, provosts, and presidents have to spend their time. In fact, the law school, even in current times, it's amazing how many of its own problems it takes care of itself with its own expertise compared to some other units. And therefore, I guess I'd say, going back to those old remarks on enrollment and everything else, you're really, the law school is a very distinct part of a university with its own language, culture, discipline, like the Netherlands within the European Union. The university is dominated culturally by arts and science, the way the European Union is dominated culturally by France. The university is, at most places, dominated economically by the medical school, the way the European Union is dominated by Germany. But the Netherlands can play a really good contribution, as the law school can, and that's because, and it's a contribution worth some subsidy in bad times, and that is because the law school is genuinely interdisciplinary, is genuinely a group of people are problem solvers and can be deployed on problems across the university. And I don't mean just deans, I mean faculty and students and alumni. It's not, the law school is disproportionately represented on the board of trustees, not because they're huge donors, but because they're great people to have on boards and great problem solvers. And so I'd say how I look at enrollment challenges at the moment is long-term. Law school enrollment is, like other parts of the university, will fluctuate based on demand in the economy, but I don't know many university presidents who don't want to have a good law school as part of their portfolio, just like the European Union would be deeply distressed by losing the Netherlands. So.
Thank you very much. Oh, yeah, please do.
So we may be talking about this more later, but I think it is the case that any university now has to be focused on student success. That is just, whether you're a public or a private, whether you are large or small. And so figuring out what that means is not easy, and one of the challenging things but also exciting things is that at the university level you can hear from many different perspectives on what that means and what kinds of innovations can be created to address the issue of success. And I think that law schools are not necessarily at the forefront in figuring that out yet, but they will be part of the process of figuring out how we both bring in not only the best, but the people who are able to move forward and succeed, and how we help them succeed once they come in.
Thank you, Phoebe. We've heard from each of the panelists about the perception of the law school within the university as a whole. So the next question is really focused on what advice do you have for law school deans for how to effectively navigate the world of the larger university and to advocate, put themselves in a position where they can be the best advocates for the needs of the law school?
So start with me again.
Let's start with Phoebe.
I think that it's really important to think about ways that the law school can help with problem solving. Because, as Kent said, we are problem solvers. We have that characteristic, but also training. And we can be very helpful to lead the way in thinking about ways. We have not been innovators necessarily, but we can be good, effective problem solvers. And so I think that collaborations are critically important for law schools within the community. because of that problem-solving effort. And as I think we've all said at this point, the fact that we are essentially interdisciplinary gives us the capacity to be able to do that. And I think that it's been a long journey for us to kind of embrace that. I remember a year ago or so, Blake Morant talked about the ways that he, as dean, had begun to work with his university and how that had paid off very effectively. I'm looking at it from the other side now, and that is the critical need we have for people who are legally trained to be involved in thinking about these things. These challenges. So for example, it is not surprising that many of our universities have lawyers as provosts these days, and have lawyers who are involved in some of the governing board and other kinds of opportunities, because that's what we do best. The other part of it is that when we talk about interdisciplinary work, we can think about ways to structure that interdisciplinary work in a manner that reflects our professional interests, but also that reflects the way we think about ways to accomplish objectives. And so talking about interdisciplinary work on our campus with arts and sciences, with business, and with nursing, which are the other schools that we have, has been very, very important for both our provost, who is a lawyer, Ray Solomon, many of you know him, but also for our young and more senior law professors who have volunteered to be parts of committees and to think about ways that the schools can collaborate. And as I said, because we have such a small system, we also have been talking about ways that we can be involved with New Brunswick and with Newark on a more meaningful level. So many of the centers are social policy centers that law professors can be involved in and want to be involved in because of the work that's being performed. At Camden, we have a focus on civic engagement. That's one of our initiatives that is the focus over the next 5 years, and it's one that is already deeply embedded in the culture. And by civic engagement, what we mean is partnering with other parts of the community of Camden and the larger region, the Philadelphia and South Jersey region. And that means also that there are opportunities for the law school to be involved in a dramatic way. We also have been talking about ways that we can be more deeply involved in the K-12 environment in Camden, which is critically important. And again, the law school has been deeply involved in that. We don't have a medical school. We have a nursing school, and we've been involved in medical legal partnerships with Cooper, which is a different university, but it also enables the law school to be deeply involved in our civic engagement work. Thank you.
So to start, maybe by picking up with what Phoebe had said earlier about student success, it's pretty clear now that the Carnegie Foundation, with its rankings, is going to include student success in their next round of Carnegie rankings. It's not clear what that's going to look like, but my own guess, and it's just a guess, is that they will do something like U.S. News has been doing for many years, which is to calculate your expected graduation rate based on ACT, SAT scores and determine how well you're performing vis-a-vis that or some similar kind of thing. You can see that from the university perspective, and for many universities, certainly for us, that will be very, very difficult with student swirl, with students coming in and out. Even very strong universities with great reputations, some of them will still have trouble with this. I mean, it won't be a problem for Berkeley or UCLA, who have 97% six-year graduation rates, but the average in the country is about 54%. And so almost everybody will have some sort of issue dealing with student success. And this is a substantial challenge. So one opportunity, though it's probably not the most efficient use of law faculty, is engagement with the campus for student success, and probably the sort of attractive things that don't drain our law faculty too much is working with the law school counselors, which of course helps with recruiting. The joint enrollment programs can help in this as well, so those are the kinds of things that many people have already been doing that I think are consonant with trying to deal with student success issues. In addition to that, there are tremendous opportunities on campus where law faculty can be helpful. All of you know the sort of Title IX crises that are being reported very heavily. That's because the Justice Department is very focused on universities' Title IX compliance, and in particular, how the universities deal with sexual assaults. Well, many universities, frankly, haven't dealt with sexual assaults. They've viewed it as a job for the police. And as a consequence, they have no infrastructure on campus to deal with that. That's an opportunity for law faculty who have expertise and ability and not too much of a distraction from what they do. But I think, as Phoebe has mentioned, for almost all universities, whether they're actually research universities or not, a tremendous amount of sort of economic research has correlated the presence of a Carnegie Tier 1 or a Carnegie Research Very High with economic success in the town, with clusters of universities, with economic success in cities. The cities that have weathered the recession best tended to have nearby a very high-performing research university. And this has led legislators and others to say, we want one of those. And they don't really know what they're talking about, of course, nor are they prepared to put the money into it that's necessary. But it does mean that the framework for thinking about universities in the future is heavily around research activity, even as those same legislators want to know why people aren't teaching like 10 classes each semester. There's no way to resolve that tension, but it does mean that universities will be focused on research productivity, even if it's not the key part of their mission. And that, I think, is a substantial opportunity for law schools to engage, even though it doesn't seem so. The main funding agencies now are obsessed with two things: translational research, which is an opportunity for law professors to be involved in small ways, but also interdisciplinary research, typically done in teams that include a translational research component. And the reason for this is very simple. Congress is asking why we spend all this money on research and it's not producing sort of real drugs on the ground or new treatments or new approaches to education. So again, this is an area that can be a huge distraction for our law faculty who have jobs already. But it does create some opportunity in appropriate context for them to join a team working on, for example, a project about improving health outcomes. And it's not just your health law or your medical ethics person who can be involved in that particular kind of project, because that's a project that's really about what are the steps that we can take that get better outcomes in a particular community. Las Vegas, because it grew so fast, has lots of nice roads because it's a new town essentially, but it lacks social infrastructure. I think when I came to be dean, there was a total of 24 legal aid attorneys in a city of 2 million. It's now up to 60, woo. But you can see that it's a city, I mean, it's one example, but there are many other examples in education and otherwise where the city simply lacks the social infrastructure to deal with the normal problems of a metropolitan area. And these have presented tremendous opportunities for law faculty to be involved in what are essentially university-wide community engagement research and teaching projects. So we've tried to structure those at UNLV, but whether they're formally structured or not, those are the kinds of opportunities that I think can serve two main goals. The first is getting the campus familiar with law faculty and their tremendous ability, which I think, you know, not to be too judgmental, I think in this context, it is very often the case that a arts and science faculty member basically believes that law faculty members are these hired guns. They sort of adopt the sort of general public's view of lawyers and attach it to a law faculty member. That's to say that they've utterly underestimated the talent, the ability of the law faculty member, and because they never get to meet or work with those folk, they continue to persist in believing that that's what exists over there. especially in the context of rumors of people making like, tens of thousands of dollars consulting, which is really appropriate to their business faculty, but not so much for the law faculty. But the capacity or ability of law faculty members to do that, I think, drives a little bit of this sort of misapprehension of who we are, and opportunities to work with faculty across campus does a tremendous job of disabusing that. The second thing is just that in a context where everyone understands the drop in enrollment, the economic pressures on law schools, it allows faculty to see the value of the institution because of what they can bring to the research mission in a way that's otherwise very difficult to connect, because what we do is very different from what our science guys do.
So the kind of question of what are effective strategies for negotiating university support for law school needs is a slightly different one at privates than at publics, and so let me talk about that from a private perspective, private university perspective a little bit, which is, and also from humility, learn from my 20 years of mistakes. Okay, and that is mission alignment. Okay, now that I've been a chancellor for a year, each of the universities I was at, for unique or idiosyncratic or good or bad reasons, had strategic priority missions. At Vanderbilt, when I was dean at Vanderbilt, for complicated reasons, there was an international focus on Latin America. At Washington University, for complicated and good and complicated reasons, there's a great focus while I was there on public health. At other universities, as you've heard, civic engagement, access to higher education, other issues. But throughout my period as dean, I also had a strategy for the law school, and it was a strategy for how the law school would be successful as against the other law schools it competed with in recruiting students and faculty and in research and service. And often those missions were not well aligned, let's put it that way, because the law school over time had chosen to emphasize Asia, not Latin America, or it didn't hire anybody in public health. It hired people because there was another law school 3 miles away that was the best law school in the world in health law, for example. And that led to local decisions within the law school to often not be aligned in mission with the priorities of the university. Well, in the current environment with law schools, if you want support for law school needs, you need to be aligned with the law school mission for whatever, with the university mission for whatever idiosyncratic reasons it's adopted. And what I'd say now from a point of view of a president or chancellor looking at law schools and realizing law schools are nimbler than most other academic units. You've got faculty members who will change their emphasis if inspired in the right ways, who will become experts in a new field, who will teach new courses. I know you don't, I've seen some wry faces looking at me, but can I just say it's more true at law schools than in other disciplines. It really is. And I say this because I've participated with my faculty in hiring faculty members who have grown in terrifically unexpected directions because that's where the exciting opportunities were. So what I'd say, if you want support for your law school from your university, get your most talented people and say to them, because the university is emphasizing X, I need you to become the best in the world at X from a law school perspective and helpful to the university in that. And I think you'll find people at various points in their careers, including some toward the end of their careers, and including some towards the beginning, who will be willing to do that if phrased in those terms as a request from you. And I think it will be good for their careers if you do that. And that's what I wish I had done more of when I was a new dean. I wish I'd said, look, I need you to spend half your time, because the university is emphasizing X, becoming really good at X. And being the one who goes to the meetings and takes the minutes and gets the job done for the university on X. I think if I'd done that more, I would have had even more support for the law school as a public good in the university than I obtained.
I can't help but add that the other real experience that at least I had was in flush times, you could hire somebody to do those kinds of things, and that's not going to happen now. So the law school has to be nimble, just like others have to be nimble in addressing these things. It's not going to be that you go out and buy the best health science people or the best Asia studies or others.
But if there's a way to get a line, it's getting on top of one of these campus-wide projects. So we have a project, and it seems like a little ambitious for us, but we have some state money behind it around translational health sciences, and they're going to have some big computers running some stuff. That seems pretty remote from the law school perspective, but there's a line there. And somebody talking about, for example, privacy issues around this big data is a possibility. And so, not that Dan's here thinking, I'm going to get a guy from John, but that's an opportunity that has state money behind it. And for publics, what often happens is you either get, well, for everybody, you'll get a grant that will give you a line for 3 years. As provost, a big part of my job is just guessing that I'll have the money to cover this in 4 years. And so I commit to lines 4 or 5 years down the road all the time because the money will run out. But if there's a big project funded by the federal government or funded by a state grant or something like that, that's often an opportunity to get a line, to sort of force the provost to have to pay for this line 4 years down the line, and really to get a commitment that you otherwise couldn't get. And in these times, any position that will teach a couple of classes is a good thing.
I guess another example is joint appointments for those kinds of lines where you can actually more than likely find somebody in the law school that might be interested in the area, and that will be able to be teamed up with another arts and sciences or business person that can also do the work.
One of the difficulties for all of us, I think, as law school deans is we're very integrated into the university, and we're getting all of this information firsthand, talking to our provost, our president, and to our fellow deans. But doesn't always get down to the faculty level, where we're not always successful at being able to communicate with our faculty the sense of urgency that we might feel or that the university feels about the need for collaboration, interdisciplinary work, seeking grant funding, which is something that law professors are not ideally trained to do in the same way in the STEM disciplines, and convincing them sometimes that this is really something that's very important to the success of the law school and to the university is very difficult. So I wonder if you have any advice, given your experiences as deans, as to how to bring your faculty on board. And Kent had one, which is to talk very honestly and say, I really need you to do this. I need you to do this for the benefit of our students and for the strength of the law school and the university. But are there others?
So one of the ways that the previous chancellor had begun and that I'm really happy to embrace is we have a small pot of incentive money and money talks. So having the opportunity to say to people, if you work together, you will be able to get that small pot of money, a small part of the pot of money to enhance either the research aspect of what you're doing or the teaching aspect, or in some way make it a stronger opportunity. And again, our campus is small enough that many people know each other, though they may not know exactly what they're doing. So what I've added to that incentive fund is an opportunity to have small lunches so that I will encourage people across disciplines to come together for lunch and talk about some of the opportunities that they might have, either already engaging in or might be interested in doing. So that those incentives also can help.
I don't know that I have a magic answer, but I do think that first, the the challenge that Kent suggested is not a challenge just for law schools. We have a number of projects that the state has more or less insisted that we take on, and we funded those projects, and the faculty that get these free lines are upset that they don't want a line in that, they want a line in something else. And so it's sort of the feedback I get all the time. We're in a significant transformation in higher education, and I think that's an issue that law faculty members and others just haven't processed yet. But particularly on the rest of the campus, you know, there are folk trying to build a program in X, and they've been toiling away at that for 25 years and slowly adding people to build that project. Well, in their area, that's not what the state cares about anymore, and that tension is an ongoing one at the university level, just like it's an ongoing one for us. Like, what's the alignment? Do we all want to duplicate, you know, X law school, or should we be more locally focused in a particular way? There's a balance there, and it's one that has to be led by faculty. And I think the key question university-wide is getting our faculty talking about this, this important transition time. If suddenly the economy starts like just churning ahead and there's like money, it's not coming to higher education. It just won't happen again. And the same kinds of standards that the administration is adopting with the president's ratings, these changes at Carnegie and other places, these are not going away, or for that matter, the pressures on the athletics side. I'm the representative here of the only Big Five conference, and it hurts, right? TCU was in the Mountain West. They used to get $3 million a year on our TV contract. They now get $35 million a year on the TV contract in the Big 12. It's a tremendous transformation of their athletics program, but for us, what happens is that we have a general public who believes in our basketball program. We can't leave it out to dry. But it's costing us money. It's costing us $3-4 million a year, despite the fact that, unlike a lot of schools, we have a revenue-producing arena that actually makes money for us. So those kinds of challenges are going to be there in athletics. The challenges we're facing in higher education are going to be there. And I think the difficulty for universities is really getting our faculty engaged in that conversation. And it's a generational problem in that many of us here are baby boomers. Our faculty are baby boomers. They're at the end of their careers. They're just not interested in changing. And leadership on our campuses really means starting that conversation at a granular level and incentivizing a campus-wide conversation about the future of higher education. Mm-hmm. That is a little pie in the sky, but it's, I think, the only option that we have.
Kent, did you want to add something?
I just say if I've learned one thing from 1 year as a chancellor, it's communication. It's that you can't communicate too much. It's my approach to deaning was pretty much the way Time Magazine used to approach covering the news, which is every week it would come out and they'd cover something, and then they'd covered it. And the next week, it was already covered, so they were supposed to cover the next thing. Well, for both for universities and for law schools, you have to over and over again communicate the same thing in so many different ways. And I think over-communicating to faculty what the situation is, over-communicating to the university what good things the law school is doing, repeatedly communicating it over and over again until they're sick of it, but they've heard it and they start communicating the message in various ways is the way to deal with this. And I've learned that the hard way.
Thank you very much. We want to open this up now to all of you. We think that you may have some very specific questions that you'd like to have addressed. I want to remind everyone before you do ask your questions, however, that it is being videotaped. So if you have certain things that you'd rather talk about in private, there will be a private section for deans later, and you may talk to any of us privately off camera. But we'd love to invite you to the microphone, and we need you to speak into the microphone so that we'll have audio. Must have been very, very depressing.
I'll take a chance. Timothy Fisher, University of Connecticut. The comments about alignment make me think about joint appointments. And we've just had our first couple between law school, tenure home at the law school, but a joint appointment with another school within the university. Can you tell us about the pros and cons of emphasizing that in future hires?
So one of the big negatives of joint appointments, and for that matter, interdisciplinary research, is who's going to judge their promotion and tenure. And we've been talking about this ever since I've been provost, and I don't think we have a magical answer to it. We actually probably have some magical answers. We don't have a good answer to it, which is to say that we're hoping that a little memorandum will, sort of solve the problem, but we haven't confronted any of those promotion questions yet. And it's a substantial challenge, especially with law school, because of how we publish, where we publish, and how we treat publications from other areas. We'd probably be okay if somebody wrote a big book, but if they wrote 40 little 5-page articles, I'm not sure our faculty would be all that interested in what they wrote. And so that, I think, is the most substantial con to it. It's easier, obviously, if you make those appointments with people who are already tenured, because you can avoid that issue. But it's not a small issue, and it's really one that turns a lot on the culture of the school, and knowing what that culture is, knowing how that person's going to come up, and being clear with the candidate that they more or less are going to have to get tenure at this place. This is not going to be a 3-and-out situation, because they won't know where they're going and they won't know how their tenure application will be viewed. But that's, I think, the big substantial issue that comes to mind for me.
I'm very positive about joint appointments, and particularly in the current environment and where universities need to go. And my main challenge as a dean I face with joint appointments is keeping people's eye on the ball that we needed to deliver a high-quality education in large numbers to our current students, and that we couldn't have large fractions of the faculty not engaged in the core mission of teaching our current students. And so reminding folks with joint appointments that each of us had some obligation to the core curriculum and the core large numbers of students in the clinics, in the large enrollment classes. I did see during my time on the Michigan faculty a challenge with large numbers of faculty vanishing from the core instruction of law students to become lawyers because of a great interest in teaching small seminars with great colleagues that had a few law students in them. And I think that was great as long as they retained a part of their portfolio engaged in the core mission with the law students.
Two quick questions. John, you alluded to undergrad, I believe, admissions, and mentioned that they basically reported elsewhere. And I was wondering if you can elaborate on the admissions situation and whether any of you have seen any endeavors or at least conversations around how law school admissions might be encompassed or in conversation with or in collaboration with or under admissions at the university level in terms of enrollment management writ large, number one. Number two, I just wanted to float the advancement question and speak to the, ask you to speak to the fundraising conversation as it implicates the university writ large and how the law school fits into that, and any suggestions, insights you might care to offer in that respect.
I think it's a bad idea to have law school admissions rolled into university admissions. I think everybody in the room will agree with that. They're really very, very different things. Sometimes, though, you will see law school admissions sort of coordinated with graduate school admissions. I don't think that's helpful either. The challenge we've had, at least with graduate school admissions, is it really has to be done at the college level, so centralizing it hasn't been productive. And it's been centralized, I think, as long as the university has existed. And there's a trend away from that, though we don't have the resources to add an admissions person in each and every unit. So law school admissions, I think, has really become at least quite a model of how admissions can be done effectively. Now, it is true that we have a closed data set with perfect information, at least if we're prepared to buy it. And that's not the case with university admissions, and what they're doing is just totally different. So I think keeping those as separate as possible is important. And I've heard of no conversations to combine them, and I would resist that. I think on the other question, this goes to one of like our guide questions, which is, how do we evaluate deans? I evaluate deans as provosts, and we do so around a list of metrics that we've agreed upon in advance. On fundraising, typically the advancement office will create fundraising goals for each of the deans and will judge whether they've met them. That's broken down for us in the recession, in large part because Las Vegas was so terribly hit. And it was a good thing when I was dean because we had no alumni. So I think we had like 900 alumni at the time the recession hit, or 600. So that would have been a tough road for me to hoe. But each year we do this review, and we're in the process of redoing it because we've switched from this headcount-based system to a outcomes-based system, and we're really building a new metric for dean's evaluations built around that, though the system that the state adopted is sort of arbitrary, so we have to do it separately so we don't create bad incentives.
So I'm not going to speak to the admissions. I agree with John, but I did want to talk about the fundraising aspect and evaluation of deans. First of all, many of our alums are both undergraduate as well as graduate alums, and so the opportunity for the university and the chancellor to be involved in the fundraising is very, very important, I think, to the development of a more effective fundraising regime. Many of the people who are lawyers don't feel the affinity to the law school necessarily, though they may feel an affinity not necessarily to their undergraduate school, but to a particular faculty member, some special person who really changed their lives. And so being able to have both undergraduate or graduate and law school advancement work that is collective, I think is going to be the wave of the future for a place like us. Evaluating what to do is still a work in process at Rutgers, in part because Rutgers itself had not really been focused on fundraising. They had relied on the state to support much of the work. So it's not surprising for many of you to know that what had been 70%, 30%, 70% generated from the state is now 30%, 70%. And so I always dealt at the University of Maryland, Carey Law School, with the proposition that we were, for all intents and purposes, a private place. We had to raise money, and that was my job. And that's what I've been trying to talk to the deans about. And some of that is nurturing, and that's something that people don't know intuitively necessarily about. And so I think that that's a really important role for a chancellor or other university leader to be involved in, helping to cultivate not only the potential donors, but also cultivate a kind of view about philanthropy within the dean's group. And then developing a metric that takes account of that complexity.
One of the things I did when I became the provost was actually include a different metric than we had ever had before around development. We had always been measured as deans on our independent success, our independent achievement. Did we bring in X amount of money for our unit? But in a complex university, we all know that we share graduates, right? And they may have divided loyalties, or they may have, as you said, loyalties to a particular professor, or more than one professor. And I discovered in that process of raising money for the law school that actually when deans behaved in a very autonomous way, that they were leaving money on the table. So I added into our metrics collaboration, the degree to which the deans are willing to work with other deans to maximize a gift, essentially. And a good example of that, we had one donor who was very loyal to business and economics, but also had a very strong connection to the law school, and we were both, the B&E dean and I were both working on the same person. So I called the dean up and I said, let's do this together. I think we can get more. Well, when we first started, we probably would have divided $3.5 million. And by the time we were finished, we got a $10 million gift because we were willing to work together. And we used it actually for some interdisciplinary, some new cutting-edge kinds of programs, which made the donor very happy. So that shaped my decision actually to change that metric to include collaboration.
So when I think about the things that are most important to the university, right? It's like, what is our Carnegie classification? How much grant money are we getting from the NSF and the NIH? What's our enrollment, right? In thousands and thousands and tens of thousands. There's not much, so the law school can't advance any of those goals. Whether you have a law school or not, you can be a Carnegie DRU. And we can't change, even in flush times, we're not going to make the university-wide enrollment better. We're actually really good on graduation rate, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, from the university's point of view, what can the law school do that advances the university? Or, kind of put another way, how can we as deans help our universities to understand that there are some things that we do that actually advance them in ways that they should embrace in their strategic plan? Because Ken, I was struck when you were saying, I don't think it was a bad decision for you not to become like another health power next to St. Louis. That's, right? Although I do get your point about wanting to align with the mission, right? So I'm trying to flip the question a little bit and just say, since none of the key metrics of a large university system can be advanced by a law school, like, how is it that we create this feeling by a university that the law school is advancing us?
Well, let me just say, first of all, yeah, I remember that frustration. The law school is not alone, okay? The situation you describe, actually most universities are this collection of 1 million niches, and actually a lot of them have the law school situation, okay? It is not the case that the law school is all, or the university is all well aligned with undergraduates in arts and sciences or with NIH research funding. It turns out there's all these niches, many of which are quite excellent, that also don't align. And so, first of all, realizing that just because one particular set of metrics at the moment consumes a university chancellor's attention, it does not mean there aren't lots of people that are trying to be universal in a university and have all the niches. And by the way, that goes for athletics, for example, and that goes for much in the humanities and much in the social sciences and other professional schools. And so, first of all, realizing that you are not alone in this unprivileged identity that is being punished and sanctioned. Yeah. Quite the contrary. Most universities have lots of people that regard the law school well because of good experiences, and that's why the chancellor and provost and whatever are lawyers or from the law school. So getting out of a sense of isolation and disfavoredness and saying, look, I'm the Netherlands. It's the European Union. I'm never going to be France. I'm never going to be Germany, but I'm the Netherlands. That's a pretty good thing to be. How can I be helpful to the collective enterprise that is the European Union, right? The way the Netherlands has been. Do you follow what I mean? How can we model best behavior, right? How can we say, gee, if the university really cares about something odd today that doesn't seem to have anything to do with us, undergraduate graduation rate, who within our unit can be helpful to that? And as an illustration of that, I just give this. So actually, the previous question, law schools do admissions very well. Okay, God, you have no idea how well organized and well thought through law school admissions is, and well coordinated through the happenstance of the law schools owning owning the equivalent of ETS or the SAT, right? But it is really it's efficient. You can apply to 50 law schools much easier than you can apply to 50 universities, and the information available is much better. So if we're worried about undergraduate access, gee, maybe whoever is the best law school admissions person ought to be helpful to a strategy for undergraduate admissions, right? I'm not saying it isn't a problem. I really, believe me, I resemble that last question. So for the last 20 years, that was my shtick. And nevertheless, now from a year as a university chancellor, I realize, turn it around and say, gee, how can we be helpful?
So I have a further illustration of what Kent's talking about. So I meet with deans once a week, and the kind of questions that you just asked were questions and comments that I hear from the deans all the time. I met with faculty members throughout the summer and in small groups. And that was the first time that I had a chance to kind of fully appreciate the angst that's being expressed by other faculty members. And it's the same thing. It's not any different in terms of whether they feel that they are deeply involved or engaged in the university and what kinds of things are not consistent with the university mission and whether they are counted in the same respect. So it was a great opportunity, I think, to more fully appreciate the other side, the dark side, or what other people have to offer and think about in terms of how we fit as a community. I also think that perhaps, especially because our community on our campus is much smaller, I think that there are significant numbers of faculty from the law school who have traditionally been involved in the life of the university. And so it's not simply kind of the what do you call it, the cathedral on the hill that is separated from everybody. They're engaged because they have to be. We're small in number and need everybody aboard. And people who have come to Rutgers-Camden Law School have tended to be interdisciplinary in approach. And so the engagement has already happened. It doesn't mean that everybody is engaged, but there are significant examples of it.
I think where it's appropriate, identifying a thing that is consonant with the university's mission. So our law school has always been focused on community engagement and sort of dealing with the social infrastructure gap, and that happens to align with the university. So even as our conversation has turned about Carnegie levels and everybody's focused on grants, and then they ask the question that you raised, which is, what's that got to do with me? Are we going to be ignored or isolated? The answer is we have a thing to fit into. And at our university, we have a College of Fine Arts, which is this issue, much more exaggerated, right? Because they're tiny faculties, they do no grants, they have tiny student bodies, but they're really high performing, and that makes sense in a town built around entertainment, so they can point to that, and the dean does a fairly decent job in fundraising because of that connectivity. But it's having a, maybe not your main mission as the university, but at least having a component of your mission as a law school be consonant with one of the university's missions, however that's structured.
Could I just say, just to put a name on it, by the way, at many universities there is schadenfreude about law schools right now. There is people taking joy in the challenges law schools are having because of a perception over the decades of law school faculty being well paid and not teaching as much and not publishing as much.
Yeah.
And what I have to say to people is schadenfreude is not a basis for strategy or decision making. And indeed, schadenfreude is the opposite. Taking joy in the challenges of others is the opposite of what you want from leaders, which is taking joy in the successes of others. And so I've found a couple times I've just had to put a name on it and say, gee, so you're enjoying this. Is that really a productive way to go forward? So.
Good morning, and thanks for this discussion. On the subject of joint appointments, in our university, at St. Louis University, it's easy to have somebody be in a secondary appointment, and it doesn't have any budgetary things. And I have a number of faculty members. In fact, years ago, before I left for a time, I had a secondary appointment. And it does get you into that. The second thing is, along the same line, I always thought when I was a younger faculty that being a member of the Faculty Senate was a waste of time. It's not. And I think it's really something to be encouraged among law school faculties. One of my faculty colleagues was on the President's Search Committee, and another, that was through his contacts with the Faculty Senate. Another one is now chairing the Provost Search Committee. So we have a new president. We're going to get a provost and try to up the game in terms of the academic mission. And we get to be much more central of that because of the involvement of faculty members in the Faculty Senate. And by the way, we are in the search for a provost. I know there's a number of talented administrators in this room who already fit my first criterion, and that is you must understand and love legal education. And my second criterion is that you must like me.
Mike also has a great president from Syracuse. So he's come
That's true, from the
the
other
Syracuse
place
area.
in Syracuse, and he's a wonderful
The
president.
other place, yes.
So far.
Are there any other questions or comments that anyone would want to make? I'm just going to ask the panelists now to close out our session with just some closing comments. And we can go in any order you choose.
Finally.
Yeah, off the hook.
I'm in the middle, it doesn't matter.
I guess I'm just going to, in terms of over-communication and saying things twice, I'm just going to say something twice, which is I went through 5 years as a dean, meetings like this, where there was great anxiety about the end of the golden age of law schools and what we're going to do. And I went to lots of those meetings and felt like the people were not, who were speaking, were not realistic about the real challenges my school or other schools were facing. And now, having been chancellor for a year, I just want to remind you that with a positive attitude, the challenges law schools are facing are two things. They are not a major factor usually in the university's challenge as a whole budgetarily. They are a budget challenge many places, but for the university as a whole, because law schools are such a relatively small piece of it, they are manageable. So first of all, while it seems overwhelming and challenging for the university as a whole, it's typical. There's always some unit in the university that is facing budget challenges. It's just that the law school hasn't been in that role for decades, and so a lot of the habits of thought and mind have not been as common within the people of the law school. And then the second observation is that law schools are really good. I mean, they're really good to have at a university, and in the worst, most challenging moments, I haven't talked to a single university president who hasn't been grateful for the faculty and leadership of people within the law school because of their perspective and their ability to contribute. And so if you channel that and channel it through everywhere where you've got supporters, on the Board of Trustees, in your alumni, in your faculty, in your students, law students make great student leaders in university-wide things. If you have a conscious strategy to cultivate it and encourage it in this tough time, a professional development strategy aimed at the university for each of your constituent groups, it will pay a lot of dividends.
I think along those lines, sort of engagement with the university in ways that don't distract from the mission of the law school is the way to sort of soothe over a lot of these issues. I think as Kent highlighted, we have a very small budget as a university. Our sort of expenditures per student are shockingly low. Even then, I could fix Dan's problems with really very little effect on my overall budget. The problem is the equity issues and the campus sort of tension that might generate. And as more universities have to create long-term plans to deal with the downturn in enrollment, it's just something that the universities are going to have to do, but they are best situated to do it if, in addition to thinking this is a nice little trophy for the president to have on his shelf, he sees the law school as engaged with the university mission in some significant way, and the law school faculty contributing. And that's not actually that difficult to do. I think it's, even though I'm recorded, I don't have any difficulty saying that the creation of the law school at UNLV added tremendous assets to the faculty. Lots of really talented folk building a school that in the scheme of things wasn't all that expensive to build. That's so much more difficult to do in lots of other areas. I mean, to be able to get, you know, if you're gonna build a law school that's sort of in the middle of the pack, you still have put together a faculty that's tremendously impressive. If you're building a middle of the pack history program, it's not clear the sort of talent level of your faculty across the board. You'll have some great people there. So it's just easier with the professional structure of law schools to bring talent to the campus that is an asset, and having the campus engage, the law school engage with the campus is a great way for the campus to understand that and to make it easier for universities to manage these issues. The big issue, though, that I think where the university and the law schools come together is that this is a period of significant change that is happening really, really fast, and is being driven by the Department of Education, by state legislators, by funding entities, by the press, and all of that requires leadership on campus. And so apropos of the point about the faculty senate engagement, and some schools, the faculty senate is where you send, you know, people who want to be engaged, but you don't really respect what they say. That's a bad thing, right? As deans, we have to send our most talented people to the faculty senate because those institutions are really important. And so as we move along in dealing with these challenges, both as law schools and as universities, we have to sort of cultivate leadership and exercise it as deans and as other administrators, because this is not going to be, it's not going to like suddenly go away, not just the law school issues, but the challenges for universities. And the pressures on universities are continuously ramping up. And I think, as I said much earlier, this shift for non-selective or not super selective universities from a sorting operation to a graduating students operation is an extraordinarily difficult one for faculty, and it really requires the university to reconceive of its mission. That's a very, very difficult thing that will require a lot of effort on our part. So, here you go.
So I think that we've already emphasized the significant changes that are going on in the universities with respect to student success, but I think more broadly speaking, what it means to be well-educated and what kind of education gets delivered is also undergoing rapid changes and rethinking. And I think that law schools have to be a part of that thinking because we will be the beneficiaries of whatever products come out of that rethinking. So we have to really be involved. And I would really urge people to encourage faculty to be parts of those conversations and to not take the, well, it worked 50 years ago, and so it should continue to work, but really think in a more innovative way about how we educate, both in the law school, but also in the university at large. I also think that what Kent just started to suggest, that we haven't even talked much about the role of our students on the campus and why that's so critically important a part of what the university means, even if the budgetary issues aren't as critical as you might imagine. Although I have to say, at a campus my size, the budgetary issues are very critical. The students do add a measure, and I have seen it dramatically in the conversations about Ferguson and the conversations about the future of education and conversations about civic engagement and our role in the communities. The law students are wonderful examples and role models, and we really have to be a part of the university from that standpoint because you really do add value.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you to the audience for being here. Please join me in thanking our panelists.